I am 76 years old, and I never thought I would live to see the day when I would feel like a stranger in my own home. Every morning I wake up and forget for a few seconds that Yvonne is no longer with me. We've been together for almost 50 years, half a century. It's amazing how fast those years have flown by. We bought our house in Middletown when we were young. I remember Yvonne taking a long time to pick out wallpaper for the living room, and me arguing with the contractor over the insulation in the attic. We moved in when Beatrice, our daughter, was only 4 years old. Every room, every corner holds memories. Yvonne used to say that home is not about walls and ceilings, but about people and stories. Now it's just walls and ceilings and me. Yvonne passed away 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed too late. Only 4 months from first symptoms to last breath. Sometimes I feel like I still haven't fully realized it. I walk around the rooms and catch myself thinking I'm about to hear her voice from the kitchen. After the funeral, Beatrice came more often. She cooked lunches, helped with the cleaning, sat with me in the evenings. She seemed genuinely concerned about me. Perhaps she was. Langston, her husband, also took part. He brought brandy, which I had never much liked, but out of politeness I drank, told me the news, tried to engage me in conversations about politics and sports. It was then, about 2 months after the funeral, that Beatrice first talked about remodeling the house. "Dad, you need to worry less about domestic things," she said, pouring tea. "You could sign the house over to me and Langston and I could move in here. We'd take care of you." I was too heartbroken at that moment to think about the legalities. Besides, deep down I was glad at the prospect of not being alone in a huge house full of ghosts of the past, but something compelled me to call Oswald Price, my old friend and lawyer. "Do you want my advice?" he asked when I told him of Beatrice's proposal. "Don't do it, Edgar. I've seen too many stories of elderly parents left with nothing because of decisions like this." "Beatrice isn't like that," I objected. "She's always been a good daughter." "Perhaps," Oswald agreed. "But Langston, I don't want to speak ill of your daughter's husband, but he always gave me the impression of a man who prioritizes his own benefit." In the end, we came to a compromise. I agreed to sign the house over to Beatrice, but Oswald insisted on a special clause in the contract. This clause guaranteed me the right of residence for life and, more importantly, contained a condition. If my rights to decent living were violated, the property automatically reverted to me. Beatrice signed the documents, not really reading the legal wording. Langston was more careful, but I think he decided it was a standard legal precaution that would never be enforced. The first few months after they moved in were almost idyllic. Beatrice often cooked my favorite meals. Langston helped organize my old photos and papers that had been gathering dust in boxes for years. We ate dinner together, sometimes playing board games in the evenings. I was beginning to think Oswald was wrong about Langston, but gradually things began to change. At first it was small things, subtle shifts in their attitudes toward me. Beatrice asked me less often what I wanted for dinner. Langston stopped being interested in my opinion of the books he was reading. My habits, such as the morning paper at breakfast or evening tea at 7 sharp, came to be regarded not as an established routine but as the quirks of an old man. 6 months after they moved in, I noticed that my belongings began to move around without my knowledge. Yvonne's picture, which had always been on the bedside table, was suddenly in a drawer. Books that were neatly arranged in a certain order were rearranged. "I was just doing some cleaning, Papa," Beatrice explained when I asked about it. "It's hard to dust when there's so much stuff." I didn't argue, but from then on I began to notice that my living space was slowly shrinking. First, my living room chair disappeared. It's too bulky and doesn't fit in with the new decor. Then my old desk was moved from the study to the second floor because Langston needs a place to work. My decades-old vinyl record collection ended up boxed up and sent to the attic because they take up too much space and you don't listen to them anyway. Each time I relented, telling myself that this is their home now and I should be grateful that they let me live here. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. This was my home, mine and Yvonne's. Every nail, every floorboard remembered our footsteps, our voices, our laughter. One day, I found an old wooden box in the dumpster that Yvonne had brought back from her one and only trip to Europe before we met. Inside were her letters to me, written in the early years of our acquaintance. "I thought it was just an old junk box," Beatrice said when I showed her what I had found. How was I to know there was anything important in there? But there was no genuine regret in her eyes, only annoyance that I had made a fuss over some old junk. I sat in my room for a long time that night, rereading the yellowed pages with faded ink, and felt an invisible wall growing between me and my daughter. Langston was more cautious in his actions, but I noticed how he was gradually alienating Beatrice from me. When I went into the room where they were talking, there was often an awkward pause. Sometimes I caught his appraising glance, as if he were estimating how long I had left. At dinner, Langston talked more and more about future plans, about how they'd renovate the house, when he never finished the sentence, but we all understood the unspoken "when you're gone." My bedroom, which had once been my and Yvonne's marital room, gradually became my only sanctuary. I spent more and more time there, avoiding seeing my daughter and son-in-law. Sometimes I heard them discussing me, thinking I couldn't hear. "He's getting stranger and stranger," Beatrice said. "Yesterday I found him sitting in the dark at 3 o'clock in the morning." "It's age, my dear," Langston replied. "We must be patient. It won't be long now." Talking like that made me feel cold inside. Once my daughter could spend hours listening to my stories about working at the IRS, about how I tracked down crooks and exposed fraud. Now I was a burden to her, a ticking clock that would soon stop. The final straw was their decision to remodel the kitchen. The same kitchen where Yvonne made her famous apple pies, where we had Sunday breakfast as a family, where Beatrice learned to bake cookies under her grandmother's tutelage. "We're thinking of putting an island in here and replacing the entire unit," Langston said, unfolding blueprints on the table. "Modern style, minimalist." "What about the sideboard?" I asked, pointing to the antique oak cabinet that Yvonne and I had bought for our 5th wedding anniversary. "Oh, we'll throw it away, of course," Langston replied nonchalantly. "It takes up too much space and doesn't fit the concept at all." I didn't argue, but that evening I called Oswald. "They're out of line," I said, trying to keep my voice low so they wouldn't hear me at the door. "I feel like a ghost in my own house." "Do you remember that clause in the contract?" Oswald asked. "It is still in force, but to activate it, you need a good reason and proof." "Such as what?" "If they restrict your access to living quarters, if they create unbearable living conditions, if they physically evict you from your room." Oswald was silent. "But it will be difficult to prove it. You need witnesses, documents." I thanked him for his advice and hung up. That night I couldn't sleep for a long time, remembering the past and thinking about the future. I remembered how Beatrice took her first steps, how I taught her to ride a bicycle, how proud I was of her success at school. Where and when did it all go wrong? When did my beloved daughter turn into someone who looks forward to my death? Maybe it all started when she met Langston. He was always ambitious, always seeking material wealth. Maybe he didn't see our house as a family nest full of memories, just real estate that could be modernized and resold for a profit. Or was it me? Was I too distant after Yvonne's death, too immersed in my grief, not noticing that Beatrice was also suffering from the loss of her mother? Still, I couldn't help thinking about that secret clause in the contract, about the possibility of getting the house back if they crossed a certain line. The thought had seemed absurd to me before. How could a daughter betray her own father so much? But now, lying in the dark and listening to the footsteps on the stairs, I allowed for the first time that it could happen. I didn't want it to. I didn't want conflict. I didn't want to sever my relationship with the only close person I had left. But with each passing day, I realized more and more clearly that I might not have a choice. Either I would humble myself and fade away quietly in my corner, or I would find the strength to fight for what was rightfully mine. Since that memorable conversation with Oswald, I had been watching the house more closely. The little things that I had previously written off as accidental or misunderstood were now forming a disturbing picture. The change in Beatrice's behavior was especially noticeable. Whereas before she had been at least occasionally interested in my opinion or well-being, now all our conversations were reduced to formal phrases at breakfast. "How did you sleep?" "Fine." "Need anything from the store?" "No, thanks." That's it. No real conversation, no memories, no interest in my life. But what really bothered me was the way she changed in Langston's presence. As soon as he entered the room, her voice would get higher, her movements more fidgety, and her gaze would constantly dart between me and her husband, as if she were afraid to say the wrong thing. Sometimes when I gave my opinion of something, whether it was the news in the paper or plans for dinner, she would instinctively look at Langston, as if waiting for his approval or disapproval of my words. One morning I went down to the kitchen earlier than usual and caught them at breakfast. They did not notice my presence, and I overheard their conversation. "He's getting more and more stubborn," said Beatrice, stirring her coffee. "Yesterday he was grumbling again about rearranging the living room." "You worry too much, dear," replied Langston, with that peculiar tone of condescending patience one uses when speaking to a fractious child. "He's just an old man clinging to the past. That's normal at his age. But the house belongs to us, and we have every right to do whatever we want in it." "I know, but still. He's my dad." "So?" Langston put his hand on her shoulder. "Do you owe him something? Remember how he treated you when you were a kid. All that lecturing, all that, you have to be the best. He was always unhappy with your grades, your friends, your choices. And now you feel guilty about some furniture rearrangement?" I froze in the doorway, hesitant to enter or leave. The way Langston had distorted the past, the way he'd manipulated Beatrice's feelings, it made me furious. Yes, I was a demanding father, but only because I saw great potential in my daughter and wanted her to realize it. I was never the tyrant he described me as. "Maybe you're right," Beatrice sighed. "It's just that sometimes I look at him and I see that daddy who taught me how to ride a bike or helped me with my homework." "That's nostalgia, honey," Langston interrupted her. "You only remember the good things and forget the rest. Besides, it doesn't last forever. Sooner or later we'll have to decide what to do with him. The house is too big for one old man to take care of. Maybe we should think about a nursing home." "A nursing home?" Beatrice sounded doubtful. "I don't know if he'd agree." "Who said anything about consent?" Langston grinned. "In his state of health, it won't be hard to convince the doctor that he needs constant care. You're a school psychologist. You should know how to do that." At that moment, I coughed deliberately and walked into the kitchen. The conversation was instantly cut short. Beatrice was blushing and fussing with the coffee pot, and Langston was staring at the newspaper with the most unruffled expression. "Good morning," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's a lovely day, isn't it?" "Papa!" Beatrice exclaimed with exaggerated joy. "You're early today. Would you like some toast?" I sat down at the table, watching her flap around me with feigned concern. Langston looked up from his paper and nodded at me as usual, but I noticed something new in his gaze. An estimate? A calculation? It was as if he was revising his plans in light of the fact that I could hear their conversation. That afternoon, I decided to do a little experiment. At lunch, I accidentally dropped my fork, and while bending over to pick it up, I caught Langston's foot. "I'm sorry, my hands aren't the same," I said with a slight smile. "Age takes its toll." "That's all right, Edgar," he said, but I saw him and Beatrice exchange quick glances. After dinner, I asked Beatrice casually if she'd seen my glasses, though I knew I'd left them on the nightstand in the bedroom. "They are in your room, Papa," she answered. "I saw them this morning when I went in to water the flowers." "That's strange," I pretended to be confused. "I was looking for them there. I guess my memory must be completely worthless." That evening I forgot to turn off the bathroom light and left the radio on as I retired to my bedroom. At breakfast the next day, Langston said casually, "Beatrice, don't you think your father should see a doctor? I've noticed some disturbing signs." "What kind of signs?" she asked anxiously. "Well, forgetfulness, coordination problems. Yesterday he dropped something several times, forgot where his things were, left the lights and the radio on." I almost laughed out loud. So predictable. One day of feigned, senile forgetfulness was enough to confirm my suspicions. They really were looking for an excuse to get rid of me, and dementia was the perfect excuse. "I'm perfectly fine," I said calmly. "I was just distracted yesterday. Who wouldn't be?" "Of course, Edgar," Langston agreed with a fake smile. "It's just that we're worried about you." After breakfast, I went up to my room, ostensibly to take a nap, but actually listening intently to the conversation, which, as I'd suspected, continued in the kitchen. "See?" Langston was talking. "These are classic signs of incipient dementia. First a little forgetfulness, then memory lapses, and then he can become a danger to himself and others, forgetting to turn off the gas, for example." "But he's always been very focused," Beatrice objected. "It's hard to believe it started so suddenly." "At his age, such changes can happen very quickly. I've read about it." Their voices grew quieter, and I couldn't make out the rest of the conversation, but I could see where it was going. Langston was methodically leading Beatrice to believe that I should be placed in a nursing home, using the slightest excuse to confirm his theory that I was incapacitated. That same day I discovered further proof of their plans. Going into Langston's office to get the newspaper he had promised to give me, I saw on his desk the prospectuses of several nursing homes and rehabilitation centers. They were neatly laid out and labeled with bookmarks. On one of them, Langston made notes in pencil. "Most affordable option, basic care, minimal amenities." I quietly closed the office door, feeling the anger building inside. They weren't just planning to get rid of me. They wanted to do it cost-effectively by shoving me into the cheapest facility possible. But the real revelation was a conversation I overheard a week later. I had come home earlier than usual from a walk. It had started to rain, and I decided not to risk my health. As I entered the house through the back door, I heard voices coming from the living room. "His room is too big for one person," Langston was saying. "If we remodeled it, we could make it a nursery and a small office for you." "Where would we move Papa?" Beatrice asked. "The little room next to the pantry. It will be just right for his needs. There will be a bed, a bedside table, and maybe a small armchair. What else do you need at his age?" "I don't know, Langston." I could hear the doubt in Beatrice's voice. "This room faces north, and it's always damp and cold. We'll put in a heater. Besides, it's a temporary solution. If his condition worsens, we'll have to think about an institution anyway." I froze in the hallway, not believing my ears. They were planning to move me from the master bedroom where I'd lived most of my life with Yvonne to a tiny, windowless room. And yet Langston was talking about it as casually as if it were a rearrangement of furniture, not the fate of a living person. "What if he refuses?" Beatrice asked. "We won't ask his opinion," said Langston. "We'll just wait until he's out of the house, move all his things, and confront him with the fact. What will he do? We own the house and we have every right to use the rooms as we see fit. But legally, he has a right of occupancy. A right of occupancy, not a right to a particular room," Langston interrupted her. "We're not kicking him out of the house. We're just optimizing the space. Besides, at his age and in good health, he's not likely to make a scene." At this point, I quietly left the house through the back door and re-entered, this time through the front door, closing it deliberately loudly behind me and calling out loudly, "I'm home!" The weather had turned bad. The conversation in the living room was instantly cut off. When I went in, Beatrice was looking at a magazine and Langston was pretending to be on the telephone. "Oh, Daddy, you're back earlier than usual," Beatrice said with a fake smile. "Did you get wet?" "No, I made it before it rained," I replied, watching their reactions carefully. "What are you guys doing here?" "Just discussing weekend plans," Langston answered quickly. "Nothing special." I nodded, pretending to believe him, and walked back to my room, feeling their stares on my back. I knew for sure now that I was running out of time. They weren't just displacing me psychologically, they were preparing to physically move me into conditions that could be construed as unacceptable to live in. That same evening, I called Oswald and arranged a meeting. Not over the phone, too risky, given that Langston might have been eavesdropping. We agreed to meet at Mary's Cafe downtown in 2 days. On the appointed day, I told Beatrice I was going for a routine checkup at the doctor's office, and she showed no interest. She used to always ask about the results of such visits, concerned about my health. Now she just nodded without looking up from her tablet. Mary's Cafe had been a long-time meeting place for Oswald and me. It was a small, cozy place with private booths where we could talk quietly without fear of being overheard. Oswald was already waiting for me there, a cup of coffee in front of him and a leather folder of documents. "Edgar," he rose to meet me, shaking my hand firmly. "It's good to see you in good health." Oswald hadn't changed much in the years we'd known each other. Still the same neat gray beard, still the same shrewd eyes behind his glasses. We'd met in college, and our friendship had only grown stronger since then. He was one of the few people I trusted completely. "By the sound of your voice on the phone, the situation has escalated," Oswald said when we had ordered and were alone. I told him everything. The overheard conversations, the plans to move me into a tiny room, the nursing home prospectuses on Langston's desk, their attempts to find signs of dementia in my behavior. Oswald listened attentively, occasionally making notes in his notebook. When I finished, he sipped his coffee in silence, pondering what he had heard. "The situation is more serious than I thought," he said at last. "They're really getting ready to get rid of you, and from the looks of it, Langston is leading the way. Your daughter seems to have some doubts, but is too much under his influence." "What am I to do, Oswald?" I asked, feeling helpless for the first time in years. "Remember the special clause in the contract we drew up?" He opened a folder and pulled out a copy of the document. Here it was, paragraph 17. "In the event that Edgar Thornberry's rights to live in dignity are substantially violated, including but not limited to being forced to live in inappropriate conditions, restricted access to living quarters, or physically evicted from the home, title to the property shall automatically revert to Edgar Thornberry without the ability to contest this decision." "I remember," I nodded. "But how do I prove that my rights have been violated?" "That's the hardest part," Oswald admitted. "We need hard evidence. If they really move you into that room against your will, it would be a clear violation. But it would be desirable to have witnesses who could confirm the coercion. What other actions on their part could be considered a violation of my rights? If they physically throw you out of the house, even temporarily," Oswald answered. "If they create unbearable living conditions, if they turn off the heating in your room, for example, or restrict access to the kitchen or bathroom, if they threaten you or put psychological pressure on you to leave the house." He paused, looking at me carefully. "But there's a subtlety, Edgar. The evidence must be obtained without provocation on your part. You must not deliberately create a situation that will force them to violate your rights. It must be their own decision." "I understand," I nodded. "But how do I secure witnesses in such a case?" "That's the difficulty," Oswald sighed. "The ideal would be neighbors or friends who happen to witness the violation of your rights. But to organize such an accidental presence without obvious provocation. He thought for a moment, tapping his fingers on the table. "There is another option," he said at last. "Audio or video recording. But there are legal subtleties here too. In our state, it is forbidden to make a hidden recording without the consent of all participants in the conversation. Although," he thought again, "if the recording is made in one's own home and involves evidence of wrongdoing, the court may make an exception. So if I record them planning to evict me or actually kicking me out of the house, could that be considered evidence?" "Potentially, yes," Oswald answered cautiously. "But witness testimony would be much more reliable. Live witnesses are always more convincing to a court of law than recordings that can be challenged as illegally made or taken out of context." We continued to discuss strategy, and Oswald suggested several possible scenarios. In the end, we concluded that I should be prepared for any scenario, but not provoke conflict on purpose. "Be careful and cautious," Oswald said lastly. "Write down all instances of disrespect, restrictions on your rights, or attempts to manipulate you. And if anything serious happens, contact me immediately." I returned home with a heavy heart but with a clear understanding of my situation. I now knew that in order to activate the special condition of the contract, I needed irrefutable proof that my rights to dignity had been violated, and that evidence had to be obtained without my explicit provocation. This meant that all I had to do was wait for Beatrice and Langston to step out of line themselves, and be prepared to document that moment with witnesses or notes. Tuesday evening began as usual. Beatrice was cooking dinner, I was sitting in the living room with the evening paper, and Langston was typing something on his laptop. Everything seemed peaceful and ordinary, but I could feel the tension building, like before a thunderstorm. The house had become uncomfortable in the last few days since my meeting with Oswald. Beatrice had hardly spoken to me, answering my questions in one-word answers. Langston was emphatically polite, but behind his smile I sensed a cold calculation. They were clearly up to something, and from the scraps of conversation I could hear, it seemed to be the realization of their plan to move me into a small room. "Dinner is ready," Beatrice called from the kitchen. I folded the paper and headed for the table, noting to myself that she'd made my favorite braised ribs tonight. An odd choice, considering her recent coldness. "It looks delicious," I said, sitting down in my seat. "Today's a special day," Beatrice smiled, pouring the wine. "Langston and I have news." I felt my insides tighten. This was it. They're going to announce their plans. I slowly cut off a piece of meat, trying to keep my hand from shaking. "We've decided to start renovations," Langston said, raising his glass. "We're going to completely renovate the second floor." "Including my room?" I asked directly, looking him in the eye. There was silence for a moment. Beatrice froze with her fork in her hand, and Langston frowned slightly, clearly not expecting such a direct question. "Well, actually, yes," he said at last. "We want to freshen up the interior of the whole house. Your room hasn't been renovated in a long time." "And where will I move during the renovation?" I continued, although I knew the answer. "There is a small room next to the pantry," Beatrice intervened. "We have already begun to prepare it. It will be very cozy, Papa." "It's a windowless room," I said calmly, "and it's always damp." "We've put in a heater," Langston said quickly, "and we put in a good bed. It'll be comfortable, I promise." I looked at my daughter, trying to find a twinge of doubt or shame in her eyes, but all I saw was determination. She was completely under her husband's influence. "And after the renovation?" I asked. "Would I go back to my room?" Beatrice and Langston exchanged quick glances. "Actually," Langston began cautiously, "we were thinking of converting your present room into a nursery and study for Beatrice. It's too big for one person, and a smaller room would be perfect for your needs." "My needs?" I repeated. "And what do you think my needs are, Langston?" "Well, you don't need much space," he shrugged. A bed, a nightstand, maybe a chair. What about bookshelves? I interrupted. My desk? The vinyl record collection you've already sent up to the attic? The pictures of Yvonne that stood on the mantelpiece until you put them away in a box? My voice remained calm, but inside everything was boiling with anger and resentment. They weren't just trying to move me into a tiny room. They were methodically erasing traces of my presence in the house I'd built with my own hands. Papa, you're exaggerating, Beatrice sighed. We just want to make the house more modern and functional. Your things won't go anywhere. They'll just be stored in more appropriate places. More appropriate for who? I asked. For me or for you? For everyone, Langston said firmly. Edgar, be reasonable. The house belongs to us, and we have the right to use it as we see fit. We're not kicking you out. We're just optimizing the space. Optimizing, I repeated. Interesting choice of word. You know, Langston, when I worked at the IRS, a lot of companies like to use the word optimize, too. It usually meant that someone was about to be laid off. Langston blushed, but quickly pulled himself together. This is completely different, he said. We care about you. You're just too stubborn to admit it. I looked down at my plate. My appetite was gone. I knew they'd already made up their minds and there was no use arguing, but I couldn't just sit there and be silent, letting them push me out of my life. That room is unfit for permanent habitation, I said. It has no natural light, it's always damp, and it's next to the boiler room, which makes it noisy. It's not a living space, it's a storage room. We've done everything we can to make it comfortable, Beatrice countered, and it's a temporary solution. Temporary until what? I asked bluntly. Until you decide it's time to put me in a nursing home? I saw the prospectuses on Langston's desk. Most affordable option, basic care, minimal amenities. That's very thoughtful of you. Beatrice turned pale and turned to her husband. Are you considering nursing homes? Langston gave me an angry look. It was just a preliminary reconnaissance, dear, just in case his condition deteriorated to the point where we couldn't provide proper care. I just wanted to be prepared for all options. My condition is perfectly fine, I remarked. Except for the recent signs of dementia you've been so diligent in documenting. It's amazing how they showed up right after you said that in my condition, it would be easy to convince a doctor to institutionalize me. You've been eavesdropping on our conversations? Langston was indignant. No, it's just that the acoustics in this house are good, I answered, especially when they're talking about what to do with the old man. Dinner finally turned into a battlefield. Beatrice looked confused, shifting her gaze from me to her husband. Langston was clearly angry that his plans had been discovered. You know what, Edgar, he said finally, pushing his plate away. We tried to do this the easy way. We've offered you a comfortable environment, taken care of you, but all you do is complain and nag. Maybe it's time to stop coddling you and just face facts. Langston, Beatrice exclaimed. Don't say that. Why not? He turned to her. We've been going round and round for too long. The house belongs to us, and we will do with it as we see fit. If your father can't accept that, that's his problem. I got up from the table in silence, folded my napkin neatly. Thank you for dinner, Beatrice, I said. It was delicious. I think I'll go to my room. Papa, wait. She started, but I was already heading for the stairs. I spent the rest of the evening in my room, listening to Beatrice and Langston arguing downstairs. Their voices rose and fell, but I couldn't make out the words. I sat in an old armchair by the window, looking out over the garden Yvonne had once laid out, and thought about how things had come to this. About 10 o'clock at night, there was a knock at the door of my room. It was Beatrice, with eyes reddened with tears. Papa, may I come in? She asked quietly. I nodded and she sat down on the edge of the bed. I wanted to apologize for Langston, she began. He shouldn't have said all that. We're not going to kick you out or send you to a nursing home. But you're still planning to move me into that room, I said. Beatrice lowered her eyes. We do want to remodel the second floor. And yes, your current room is too big for one person, but we'll make sure you're comfortable in your new place. Beatrice, I looked her straight in the eye, do you really think a windowless room the size of a pantry can be comfortable for a permanent residence? She was silent, avoiding my gaze. I remember how outraged you were when you read in the paper about the nursing home where the elderly were kept in tiny rooms with no natural light, I continued. You said then that it was inhumane. What's changed, Beatrice? The situation is different, she murmured, and it's a temporary solution. Temporary how? I asked, but she didn't answer. We sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Beatrice stood up. We'll start renovations in a week. You have time to pack and decide what you want to take with you to your new room. With these words, she walked out, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The following days passed in tense silence. I took no action, just watched Beatrice and Langston prepare for the renovation. They measured the walls, ordered materials, discussed the design. No one asked my opinion. On Friday night, 3 days after our dinner conversation, what I subconsciously expected to happen happened. We were sitting at the table again, eating dinner in tense silence when Langston announced, "Tomorrow the workers are coming to remove the wallpaper in Edgar's bedroom. We need to clear the room of furniture." So soon? I wondered. I thought I had a week to pack. "There's been a change of plans," Langston cut him off. "The crew got off early, and we decided not to miss the opportunity." "I haven't had time to pack all my things yet," I countered. "I haven't decided what I'm going to take with me to my new room." "We'll help you pack," Beatrice said, avoiding my gaze. "It'll be fine, Dad." "I'd rather go through my things myself," I insisted. "There are a lot of personal items, letters, documents." "You'll have time for that later," Langston said impatiently. "Right now, the main thing is to get the workman's room." "What if I refuse to move in tomorrow?" I asked bluntly. Langston looked at me with ill-concealed irritation. "It's not a matter of choice, Edgar. The renovations start tomorrow, whether you want them to or not." I felt anger building inside, but I held it back. This wasn't the time for an open confrontation. "I understand," I said calmly, "but I need at least tonight to pack the essentials." "Of course, Papa," Beatrice agreed quickly, casting a warning glance at her husband. After dinner, I went up to my room and began packing, hearing Beatrice and Langston arguing again downstairs. Their voices grew louder and louder, and at one point I heard the front door slam. Looking out the window, I saw Langston get into his car and drive away. About an hour later, Beatrice knocked on my room again. She looked upset and agitated. "Daddy, I need to talk to you," she said, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "I know this all seems wrong, but understand, Langston and I just want to make the house more modern and comfortable for everyone. And this little room, it's not so bad. We tried to make it cozy." "I've seen the room, Beatrice," I replied. "There are no windows, and it's damp and noisy from the boiler room. It's not habitable." "But we have installed a heater and good lighting," she exclaimed. "And the noise from the boiler room isn't so bad. You just don't want to give it a chance." I looked at my daughter and saw in her eyes not concern but irritation. She wasn't trying to understand my feelings. She wanted me to stop resisting their plans. "Beatrice," I said quietly, "this room is smaller than a cell in a prison. Do you really think it's the right place for your father?" "You exaggerate everything," she flared up. "Why can't you just accept what we're trying to do for you? Why are you always unhappy with everything?" "I'm unhappy about being evicted from my room to a windowless cubbyhole," I answered. "Anyone would be unhappy in my place." Beatrice stood up, her face flushed with anger. "You know what? Langston is right. You're an ungrateful egotist. We took you in, took care of you, and all you do is complain." "Took me in?" I repeated, feeling my insides grow cold. "Beatrice, this is my home. I lived here long before you married Langston. I built it with my own hands for your mother, but it belongs to us now." she blurted out, "and we have every right to do with it as we see fit." That's when Langston came back. I heard the front door slam and then his footsteps on the stairs. He came into the room, took a look at the situation, and approached Beatrice, putting his hand on her shoulder. "Is everything all right, darling?" he asked. "No, it's not all right," she replied, sobbing. "Papa refuses to realize that we're doing everything for his own good." Langston gave me a cold look, then leaned toward Beatrice and whispered something in her ear. Her face changed, anger replaced by determination. She straightened up and said, "You know what, Papa? If you don't like the room we've prepared for you so much, you can sleep in the garage. No one will disturb your precious peace there." I froze in place, not believing my ears. Beatrice, my daughter, had just offered to let me sleep in the garage like a stray dog. I looked at her, trying to find a drop of regret in her eyes, but I saw only cold determination. "Are you serious, Beatrice?" I asked quietly. "Absolutely," she replied. Her arms crossed over her chest. "Maybe after a night in the garage you'll appreciate what we're doing for you." I felt something inside me finally snap. The last thread that connected me to my daughter was severed. I got up slowly, took the small bag of essentials I had packed from the bed, and headed for the door. "As you wish," I said as I walked past them. "Good night." The garage was a few meters from the house. It was a large room with a concrete floor and a workbench against the far wall. I used to spend a lot of time here doing carpentry work. Now it was just storage for garden tools and old things. I turned on the light and looked around. In the corner was an old cot that we had used for camping years ago. Next to it was a worn chair that Langston had thrown out of the living room during the space optimization. I grinned at the bitter irony. These discarded items would now become my temporary furniture. After unfolding the cot and laying down an old blanket I'd found in the closet, I sat in the chair and thought. The situation, for all its humiliation, was actually playing into my hands. Beatrice, by her actions, had activated the very condition in the contract that Oswald had spoken of. She had evicted me from the house, albeit temporarily, creating unacceptable living conditions. Now all I needed was witnesses to that fact. I pulled out my cell phone and wanted to call Oswald, but I changed my mind. It was too late, and besides, the call might look like an attempt to organize witnesses. Better to wait for the situation to resolve itself naturally. Around 11 p.m., I heard footsteps in the driveway. Someone was approaching the garage. I tensed, thinking it was Beatrice or Langston coming to see if I was really sleeping there. But it was Walter Jenkins, my neighbor across the street. "Edgar?" he called, peering through the ajar door of the garage. "Are you in here? I saw the light and decided to check it out. Isn't it a little early for gardening?" Walter was about my age, and we'd been friends for years. Sometimes we played chess or just sat on the porch discussing the news. "Hello, Walter," I said, not getting up from my chair. "Come on in. I don't work here. I live here, temporarily." Walter walked into the garage and stared in surprise at the cot and my stuff. "What's going on, Edgar?" he asked. "Why are you sleeping in the garage?" I sighed. A little family disagreement. Beatrice and Langston decided to start renovating my room and suggested I move into a windowless den. I disagreed, and Beatrice offered to let me sleep in the garage. Walter whistled. "Really? Your own daughter put you out in the garage? That's not right, Edgar." "I know," I nodded. "But there's nothing I can do about it now. I'll spend the night here, and tomorrow we'll see." "Why don't you come to my place?" Walter suggested it. "I've got a spare room. You don't have to sleep on that old cot." "Thanks, friend, but I'll stay here," I said. "It's a matter of principle." Walter nodded understandingly. We talked some more and he left, promising to come back in the morning. I lay down on the cot, but I couldn't sleep. I thought of Beatrice, of how she had changed under Langston's influence, of how quickly family ties fall apart when money and property come into play. In the morning, I was awakened by a knock on the garage door. It was Ray, the mailman who had been serving our neighborhood for years. "Good morning, Mr. Thornberry," he said, handing me a package. "I have the book you ordered for you. Sign here, please." I took the clipboard from him to sign, and Ray finally noticed the cot and my things. "You slept here?" he wondered. "Yeah, temporarily moved into the garage," I answered calmly. "A little family disagreement." Ray shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, obviously unsure of what to say. "Are you all right, Mr. Thornberry?" he finally asked. "Maybe you need some help." "I'm fine, Ray. Thank you for your concern," I smiled. "Just a misunderstanding with my daughter and son-in-law. It'll be resolved soon." The mailman nodded, but I could tell by the look on his face that he was concerned. As he left, he cast another glance at my temporary shelter and shook his head. In the afternoon, as I sat in a chair in front of the garage, I was approached by a young couple who had recently bought the house across the street, Barbara and Trevor Ellis, if I remembered correctly. "Mr. Thornberry," Barbara called out. "Sorry to bother you, but we were wondering, we're having trouble with our lawnmower and the neighbors said you're an expert on machinery. Maybe you could take a look at it." "Sure," I agreed, getting up. "Let's see what's wrong." We headed toward their house, and on the way Trevor remarked, "I saw you sleeping in the garage last night. Is there a problem with the house?" "No, there's nothing wrong with the house," I replied. "Just a little family disagreement. My daughter and her husband decided to renovate my room and suggested I move into the closet. I declined, and my daughter offered to let me sleep in the garage." Barbara and Trevor exchanged glances. "But this is your house, isn't it?" Barbara asked cautiously. "Technically it belongs to my daughter now," I explained. "I signed it over to her after my wife died, but I have the right of occupancy for life." "And they evicted you to the garage?" Trevor exclaimed. That's wrong." "Temporary hardship," I shrugged, trying to look calm. "It's no big deal." I met the second night in the garage more prepared. After Barbara and Trevor Ellis left, I decided to set up my temporary home a little. The old cot was stiff, and my back ached mercilessly after the first night. I found some old blankets in a corner of the garage and folded them into a mattress. I made a small table out of drawers for books and a cup of tea. I brought a folding chair from the garden so that I wouldn't have to sit in a chair all the time. Walter stopped by again in the evening, bringing a thermos of hot soup and homemade bread. "I can't believe you're still here," he shook his head. "Hadn't Beatrice come to her senses?" "She hasn't left the house all day," I answered. "Langston had pretended not to notice me when he left for work this morning." "That's a hell of a thing," Walter grumbled. "Throwing your own father out in the garage. I never thought Beatrice would do such a thing." I sighed. I didn't think so either. But Langston has a tremendous influence on her. She's completely changed since marrying him. We talked some more and Walter left, again offering his spare room, which I again declined. I needed to stay here to have irrefutable proof that my rights had been violated. Left alone, I settled into a chair with a book, but I couldn't concentrate on reading. My thoughts kept returning to Beatrice, to our relationship, to the moment when everything started to fall apart. Beatrice had always been a smart and determined girl. As a child, she loved listening to my stories about my work, about how I tracked down tax cheats. "Daddy Detective," she called me. We were close, especially after she went to school. I helped her with homework, taught her how to ride her bike, took her to baseball games. As teenagers, of course, the typical problems began. The first conflicts, the desire for independence, arguments about curfews and appropriate friends. But even then, there was still a mutual understanding between us. Yvonne often said that Beatrice was a copy of me, just as stubborn, principled, and fair. After college, Beatrice began working as a school psychologist. She helped troubled teenagers, children from dysfunctional families. I was proud of her desire to make the world a better place. And then Langston Higgs came into her life. Tall, personable, with impeccable manners and an ambition that knew no bounds. He worked as an insurance appraiser, but he was always talking about his plans to open his own firm, about prospects, about financial success. At first, I didn't see anything wrong with him. He was polite, showed interest in my career, asked the right questions. Yvonne liked him too. "He'll be able to take care of Beatrice," she said after their first visit. But gradually I began to notice worrying signs. The way Langston always made decisions for Beatrice. The way she looked at him more and more often before giving her opinion. The way her voice changed in his presence, becoming higher, more uncertain. The way her old friends who didn't fit into the new lifestyle Langston was creating for them disappeared one by one. I tried to talk to Yvonne about it, but she thought I was being too picky. "You're just afraid of losing your daughter," she said, and maybe there was some truth to that. But I did see Beatrice change, and not for the better. After the wedding, they saw each other less and less. Beatrice called only on holidays, and the visits became short and formal. Langston always found reasons to shorten them: important meetings, urgent matters, tiredness after work. And then Yvonne fell ill, and things changed once more. Beatrice began to come more often, first alone, then with Langston. I saw in his eyes not sympathy, but calculation. He was appraising the house, the furnishings, estimating the cost. Sometimes I caught his eyes wandering over the walls, as if he were already planning renovations. After Yvonne died, he became particularly active. It was he who had suggested to Beatrice the idea of remodeling the house, of moving in with me to take care of it. And I, weakened by grief, agreed. If it hadn't been for Oswald's insistence, I wouldn't have even included that life-saving clause about repossession. Sitting in the garage, I suddenly realized that I had no hatred for Langston, only a weary contempt for a man for whom material possessions will always trump human relationships. But Beatrice, her betrayal hurt far more deeply. How could my daughter, whom I had raised with love and care, turn her back on me so easily? How could she forget everything Yvonne and I had taught her? Maybe I was guilty of something myself. Had I been too strict with her as a child, too demanding? Or on the contrary, had I not prepared her enough for life, for the fact that not all people are guided by the principles of honesty and justice? These thoughts swirled in my head until I fell asleep in the chair, not having reached the cot. The morning began with rain drumming on the garage roof. I woke up with a stiff neck and a sore back. It wasn't a good idea for an old man to sleep in a chair, but there wasn't much choice. I stood up, stretched, kneading my joints, and walked to the garage door. The house was dark and quiet with only the kitchen light on. Beatrice was usually up early to make breakfast before work. I decided not to go into the house. If they wanted me to live in the garage, so be it. I had a thermos of leftover soup from Walter and some bread. That should be enough for breakfast. And then I need to call Oswald. Around 9 in the morning, when the rain had stopped, I dialed my friend's number. Oswald answered after the second ring. "Edgar? Good to hear from you. How are you?" "Not so good," I answered. The situation had gotten worse. I told him what had happened, how Beatrice had kicked me out into the garage after Langston had whispered something in her ear. About how I had already spent 2 nights in the garage and none of them had even tried to check on me. "That's a serious violation of your rights to decent living," Oswald said after a pause. "In fact, they evicted you from your home, albeit on the property. The garage is not meant for living. It lacks the necessary amenities. That activates a clause in our contract." "Are you sure?" I asked. "Wouldn't it look like an overreaction to a temporary situation?" "Edgar," Oswald's voice became serious. "They threw a 76-year-old man out to sleep in the garage. That's not just a breach of contract, it's inhumane. You have every right to get your house back." I sighed. "I have witnesses. Several neighbors have seen me sleeping in the garage and know the reason why." "Did you organize these witnesses on purpose?" Oswald asked cautiously. "No, I answered honestly. They came by themselves. Walter, the letter carrier, the new neighbors across the street. I was just answering their questions. Good, said Oswald with relief. It's important that the evidence came naturally, without your active participation. It makes them more weighty in a legal sense. We talked some more, and Oswald suggested, I will prepare all the necessary documents to activate the repossession clause. If you decide to act, everything will be ready. I can bring them to you tonight. Thank you, Oswald, I said. I'll be waiting. After the conversation, I felt strangely relieved. The decision was not yet final, but the very possibility of acting, of regaining control of my life, was energizing. I decided to do some gardening to take my mind off my heavy thoughts. The old rose bushes that Yvonne had once planted needed pruning. The work was monotonous but soothing. As I trimmed the dry branches, I felt I was cleansing not only the garden but my thoughts as well. Mr. Thornberry? I heard a woman's voice and turned around. Eleanor Pratt, a neighbor who lived 3 houses down from us, was standing on the path. She was an elegant lady in her 60s with a small dog on a leash. We didn't know each other well, but we always said hello when we met. Good morning, Mrs. Pratt, I replied, shaking my hands off the ground. I haven't seen you working in the garden for a long time, she said. It's usually your brother-in-law, isn't it? Yes, Langston has been doing most of the gardening lately, I nodded, but today I've decided to do the roses myself. They require special care. Eleanor looked at me carefully, then turned her gaze to the garage where the door was open, revealing the cot and my things. Pardon my curiosity, Mr. Thornberry, but do you live in the garage? I sighed. Temporarily. A little family disagreement. Family disagreement? She interjected. The kind that forces an elderly man to sleep in the garage? That's not the usual. My daughter and son-in-law have decided to renovate my room, I explained calmly. I disagreed with their plans, and Beatrice offered to let me sleep in the garage. Eleanor looked shocked. But this is your house. I remember when you and your late wife built it. You lived here long before your daughter got married. Technically, it's Beatrice's house now, I said. I signed it over to her after Yvonne died. And she evicted you to the garage? Eleanor shook her head. That's just outrageous. You must do something about it, Mr. Thornberry. I'm working on it, I replied with a slight smile. Don't worry, Mrs. Pratt. It'll all work itself out. She expressed her indignation for a while longer, then left, promising to come back later to make sure I was all right. I went back to work in the garden, but my thoughts were no longer so heavy. The support of my neighbors, even if it was in the form of simple human involvement, was energizing. The day passed in work and reflection. I saw Beatrice leave for work in the morning and return in the evening. She cast a glance in my direction but did not approach me, did not ask how I was. Langston, too, left and returned, defiantly ignoring my presence. They acted as if I didn't exist, as if I were a ghost, invisible and inaudible. About 7 o'clock in the evening, Oswald arrived. He parked his old Buick at the curb and walked up to the garage, holding a leather folder of papers. So this is where you live now, he said, looking around the garage. Impressive. Welcome to my humble abode, I grinned, gesturing for him to come in. Have a seat. But there's nothing to sit on except a chair and a cot. Oswald sat down in the chair, put the folder on his lap, and looked at me carefully. How are you holding up, Edgar? Surprisingly well, I replied. Sure, my back hurts from the damn cot and it's cold at night, but mentally, I'm as ready to fight as I've ever been. That's good, because the paperwork is ready, Oswald said, opening a folder. Here is the official notice of activation of the repossession condition. It is based on paragraph 17 of our contract. It states the violation of your rights to decent living conditions, including eviction to an uninhabitable property. He pulled out another document. And this is a formal eviction notice for Beatrice and Langston. By law, they must vacate the premises within 30 days of receiving the notice. I took the papers, ran my eyes over them. It was impeccable, in Oswald's typical style, clear, legally correct, and free of double interpretation. "When do you plan to deliver these documents to them?" Oswald asked. I thought, tomorrow. I've already spent 2 nights in the garage, and that's enough to prove a violation of the terms. Tomorrow night, over dinner. "Good idea," nodded Oswald. "A formal setting, witnesses in the form of themselves. They won't be able to claim that they didn't receive the notice." He looked at me carefully. "Are you sure you want to do this, Edgar? It's a big step. It could lead to a complete breakdown in my relationship with my daughter." I sighed. "The relationship is already broken, Oswald. The moment she chose money and her husband's influence over respect for her own father, she ceased to be the Beatrice I knew. I grieve for the daughter I lost, but the Beatrice of today is a stranger." Oswald nodded understandingly. "I'll be in touch. If you have any problems, call me anytime." He left, and I remained sitting in the garage, looking at the documents in my hands. Tomorrow I will make a drastic move that will change our lives forever. I'll get my house back, but I'll lose my daughter. Although, to be honest, I lost her a long time ago. The 3rd night in the garage was the coldest. The temperature had dropped, and the old space heater I found among my belongings was barely coping. I lay on the cot, wrapped in blankets, and thought about tomorrow, about how my life would change after I handed over those papers, about living alone again in a big house full of memories. But there was no bitterness in those thoughts, just a tired acceptance of the inevitable. I had done everything I could to preserve my relationship with my daughter. Now it was time to take care of myself, my dignity, my right to respect. I woke up early this morning feeling strangely calm. The decision had been made, and there was no more doubt. I washed my face with the garden hose, shaved with a small mirror I found in the toolbox, and changed into the clean shirt I had brought with me. The day passed in suspense. I saw Beatrice and Langston leave for work without paying any attention to me. Walter came by in the afternoon bringing sandwiches and coffee, asking if I needed help. I didn't tell him my plans, just thanked him for his concern and told him that everything would be resolved soon. In the evening, when Beatrice and Langston returned from work, I saw them preparing for dinner. The lights were on in the kitchen, and there were the sounds of dishes and the smells of food cooking. I waited until they were seated at the table, then picked up my file folder and headed toward the house. The front door was unlocked. I entered and walked straight into the kitchen. Beatrice and Langston were already sitting at the table, plates of pasta and glasses of wine in front of them. They looked surprised to see me. "Dad?" Beatrice put her fork down. Have you decided to come back?" "In a way," I answered, walking over to the table. "I decided to take back what was rightfully mine." I put the documents from the folder in front of them. "What are these?" Langston asked, without touching the papers. "Official notice," I said calmly. "According to paragraph 17 of the property transfer agreement I'd made with Beatrice, in the event of a material breach of my rights to live in dignity, including eviction from the house or being forced to live in substandard conditions, ownership of the house would automatically revert to me. Evicting me to the garage for 3 nights is such a violation. The house belongs to me again." Langston grabbed the documents, began looking through them quickly. His face first turned white, then red with anger. "Is this some kind of a joke?" he exclaimed. "You can't just take the house back." "I can," I replied calmly, and I just did. The second document is the official eviction notice. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. Beatrice sat frozen with her mouth open. She looked from me to the papers in Langston's hands, unable to utter a word. You planned this whole thing," she whispered at last. "You brought it to this on purpose, to activate this clause." "No, Beatrice," I shook my head. "I didn't plan it. I had hoped that I would never have to use that item. I hope that your attitude toward me would never get to the point of evicting your own father in the garage. But you made your choice. Now, I'm making mine. We're going to challenge this in court, Langston said, tossing the papers on the table. You can't prove that we violated your rights. I can, I replied. I have witnesses. Walter Jenkins, Postman Ray, Barbara and Trevor Ellis, Eleanor Pratt. They all saw me sleeping in the garage and know the reason why. I didn't organize these testimonies on purpose. They will simply confirm what they saw with their own eyes. Langston's face contorted with rage. He opened his mouth to say something, but Beatrice put her hand on his shoulder. Wait, she said, looking at me. Daddy, let's talk. This is all some kind of misunderstanding. We weren't going to evict you permanently. It was just a temporary measure. A temporary measure? I repeated. 3 nights in a cold garage for a 76-year-old man is a temporary measure. Do you really believe that, Beatrice? She lowered her eyes, unable to bear my gaze. Yet, I didn't think you'd take it so seriously, she mumbled. We just wanted you to understand our position. No, Beatrice, I interrupted. You wanted to break me, to make me submit to your plans, to move me out of my room into a windowless cubbyhole, and then, when I'd finally become a burden, to send me to the cheapest nursing home with basic care and minimal amenities. I'm not blind or deaf. I've seen the avenues, heard your conversations. Beatrice jumped up from her chair. It was Langston. It was he who insisted on the repairs, on your moving in. I was always against it. That's not true, my dear, Langston interposed. You said yourself that your father was taking up too much space, that his things were in the way, that he— I'm not! Shut up, cried Beatrice. I never said such things. I watched the scene with sad calmness. They had already started blaming each other, trying to avoid responsibility. Typical. That's enough, I said firmly. The decision has been made. The papers have been filed. You have 30 days to move out. If you need help finding a new place to live, I can offer the contacts of several realtors. You can't do that, Langston hissed. You can't just throw us out on the street. I'm giving you 30 days, as is the law, I replied. That's more than you gave me when you evicted me to the garage. And I'm not throwing you out on the street. You have the means to rent an apartment or even buy your own house. You both work. You have a steady income. I turned to leave, but Beatrice grabbed my arm. Daddy, please. There were tears in her eyes. Don't do this. We can fix this. We won't do any repairs. You can stay in your room. Please. I looked at her with a long look. It's too late, Beatrice. You made your choice when you chose your husband's ambition over respect for your father, when you agreed to evict me to the garage to teach me a lesson, when you let Langston manipulate you and turn you into someone I no longer recognize. I'm your daughter, she whispered. Doesn't that mean anything? It does, I answered. That's why it hurts so much. But sometimes you have to admit that a relationship is irretrievably broken. 30 days, Beatrice. After that, I hope never to see you again. With these words, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving them in stunned silence. The morning after the eviction notice was surprisingly quiet. I woke up in my room, in my bed, and for a few minutes I just lay there staring at the ceiling. Birds were chirping outside the window, sunlight streaming through the curtains. Everything was the same as before, but at the same time completely different. I went down to the kitchen about 7 in the morning, expecting to find Beatrice and Langston there, but the house was empty. On the table was a note. Gone to work. Talk to you tonight. Beatrice's handwriting, neat and even as always. No emotion, no trace of last night's scene. I made myself a coffee and sat at the table, wondering what would happen next. I was sure they wouldn't give up so easily. Langston, with his ambition and self-righteousness, was probably already consulting lawyers, looking for loopholes in our contract. Beatrice might be wavering between loyalty to her husband and guilt toward her father. But in the end, I knew she would choose Langston. She always chose him. About 10 o'clock in the morning, Oswald called. "How did the delivery of the papers go?" he asked without preamble. I told him about the scene in the kitchen last night, about Beatrice and Langston's reaction, about their threat to challenge everything in court. "Expect it," Oswald said, "but they don't stand a chance. The contract is flawless. The activation clause is clearly spelled out. In addition, we have witnesses who can confirm the fact of your eviction to the garage. They can claim that I went there voluntarily," I said. "They might," Oswald agreed, "but it's easy to disprove. Why would a 76-year-old man voluntarily sleep on a cot in a cold garage when he has a comfortable bedroom in the house? It's illogical, and any court would realize that." After talking to Oswald, I decided to put the house in order. In the months that Beatrice and Langston had lived here, they had managed to change the interior considerably. My belongings had been moved, boxed up, sent to the attic or cellar. Many items dear to my heart disappeared without a trace. I started with the living room, putting back in place photos that Langston had removed as outdated. A picture of Yvonne in the garden, a portrait of her and me on our silver wedding day, old family snapshots of Beatrice as a little girl with 2 pigtails. I arranged them on the shelves, on the mantelpiece, giving the house back its history and soul. The day passed in such a busy way, and by evening I felt tired but also satisfied that the house was gradually returning to its former appearance. I was about to prepare my supper when I heard the sound of a car coming up. Beatrice and Langston had returned, and judging from the fact that there was a third person with them, they were going to have a serious conversation. I met them in the hallway. Beatrice looked pale and tense. Langston looked determined and confident. With them was a middle-aged man in an expensive suit who held a leather briefcase, obviously a lawyer. "Good evening," I said calmly. "I take it we have guests?" "This is Mr. Hunter, our lawyer," Langston introduced without even saying hello. "We'd like to discuss yesterday's, incident." "Of course," I nodded. "Come into the living room." They followed me into the living room, and Langston noticed the change in the interior. "What have you done to our living room?" he exclaimed, looking around. "Where are the modern pictures? Where are the new lamps?" "I've put everything back where it belongs," I replied simply. "It's my house again, and I prefer it to look the way it did when Yvonne was here." "Let's get down to business," the lawyer said, sitting down in his chair and opening his briefcase. "Mr. Thornberry, I have read the documents you handed to my clients yesterday. I must say that they are drafted unusual, but perfectly legal," I said. "If you have any doubts, you can contact my lawyer, Oswald Price." "Oh, I've already contacted Mr. Price," Hunter nodded. "We had a lengthy conversation this morning. He very persuasive in his defense of your position." I saw Langston twitch nervously. Apparently the results of that conversation had not met his expectations. "Nevertheless," Hunter continued, "my clients are challenging the breach of contract. They claim that you voluntarily moved into the garage for a few days, and that this cannot be considered an eviction or an uninhabitable condition." "I understand their position," I said calmly, "but the facts say otherwise. Beatrice had explicitly ordered me to go to the garage to sleep after Langston had whispered something in her ear. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an ultimatum." "That's not true," Beatrice exclaimed. "I never ordered you to sleep in the garage. I just said that if you didn't like the room we'd prepared, you could sleep in the garage. That was sarcasm, not an order, which you reinforced by locking my bedroom door," I remarked. "I discovered it when I tried to come back at night." Beatrice turned even paler. "I did not lock your door. It was just an accident." "Anyway," Mr. Hunter intervened, "it's your word against their word. Without witnesses, this argument has no weight in court." "I have witnesses," I said. Several neighbors saw me sleeping in the garage and know the reason why. Walter Jenkins, who lives across the street, stopped by both nights and brought me food. Ray, the mailman, saw me this morning and was surprised to find me there. Barbara and Trevor Ellis, the young couple across the street, also saw me sleeping in the garage. Eleanor Pratt spotted me while walking her dog. All of them are willing to confirm that I was living in the garage out of choice. Langston and Beatrice exchanged worried glances. Mr. Hunter frowned. "Did you purposefully arrange these testimonies?" "No," I answered honestly. They had noticed the unusual situation on their own. I was merely answering their questions. Ask them yourself if you don't believe me. Mr. Hunter tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the arm of his chair. It was obvious he was reconsidering his strategy. "Even if your residence in the garage is proven," he said at last, "there is still the question of the proportionality of the response. Eviction from the house for staying in the garage for 3 days might be considered by the court as excessive punishment." "It's not about 3 days," I objected. "It's about intent and attitude. Beatrice and Langston plan to move me into a windowless, uninhabitable room next to the boiler room. They had already begun preparations for this without asking my consent. The garage was only a temporary measure to break my resistance, and in the long run they were considering a nursing home, and the cheapest one at that. I have proof of that too, the prospectuses with Langston's notes that I found in his office." Mr. Hunter looked at Langston. "Is it true?" Langston looked as if he were about to fall through the ground. "I was just exploring the options, in case Edgar's health deteriorated to the point where we couldn't provide proper care." "There's nothing wrong with my health," I pointed out. "It was fine until you started looking for signs of dementia. I heard you talking about how easy it would be to convince a doctor to hospitalize me." Beatrice jumped up from her seat. "It was Langston. It was he who insisted on all this. I was always against it." "No, you haven't." Langston was indignant. "You said yourself that your father was becoming a problem, that he was interfering with our plans for the future." They began to argue, blaming each other, oblivious to the presence of Mr. Hunter and me. The lawyer watched the scene with professional interest, obviously drawing conclusions for himself. "That's enough," he said at last, raising his hand. "I think we should take a break and discuss strategy in private." I went out onto the veranda, sat down in the old rocking chair that Yvonne had once loved, and waited. After about 20 minutes, the door opened and Mr. Hunter came out onto the veranda. "Mr. Thornberry," he said, "after discussion with my clients, I have come to the conclusion that litigation in this case is not in their best interests. Even if there is a chance to challenge the activation of a contractual term, the process will be long, expensive, and public. The reputational risks to Mr. and Mrs. Higgs would be significant. I have recommended that they agree to your terms and vacate the house within the specified time frame," Hunter continued. "However, they are asking for some concessions. In particular, an extension to 60 days instead of 30, so that they can find a suitable place to live." "I'll agree to 60 days, I said, "provided they immediately stop any attempt to change the interior of the house or move my belongings without my consent." "That's a reasonable request," Hunter nodded. "I'll give them your answer." Some time later, Beatrice came out onto the veranda, alone, without Langston or Mr. Hunter. "Papa," she said quietly, "I need to talk to you. Alone." "Yeah, I don't know how it came to this," she began. "We weren't planning on evicting you or putting you in a nursing home. At least, I didn't. Langston, he has his own way of looking at things. He always thinks in practical terms, sometimes too practical." "It's not practicality, Beatrice," I objected. "It's greed and lack of respect. He sees this house only as a possession to be used or sold for profit. He doesn't see the stories, the memories, the soul that your mother and I put into it." Beatrice lowered her eyes. "I know. And I should have realized that, but I let him convince me that we were acting in your best interests, that a small room would be more comfortable for you, that you yourself would be glad to be rid of the trouble of looking after a big house. Did you really believe that? I asked. Or were you just repeating what Langston said to justify yourself? She was silent for a long time, then said quietly, "Probably the second. Deep down, I knew it was wrong, but it was easier to agree with it than to confront it. Langston, he could be very persuasive. What happens now?" she finally asked. "To us, to you and me." I sighed. "I don't know, Beatrice. You betrayed my trust. You let my husband force me out of my own home. You evicted me to the garage. These are not things that are easily forgotten or forgiven." "I understand," she said quietly. "But you're my father. You're the only person I have left besides Langston. Isn't there any way to make it right?" "Time will tell," I replied. "Right now, I need space and time to heal. And you might want to think about your life, about your decisions, about who you are without Langston's influence." The following weeks passed in a strange coexistence. Beatrice and Langston began looking for a new place to live, gradually packing up their belongings. I was rebuilding the house, restoring it to its former appearance. We lived under the same roof but hardly crossed paths. At the end of the second week, I contacted another lawyer and revised my will. Previously, all my property, including the house, was to go to Beatrice upon my death. I now decided that the bulk of the inheritance would go to a charity to help elderly people who were in hardship because of the actions of relatives. Beatrice and Langston found a new home a month and a half later, a modern cottage in an upscale neighborhood near the city center. Judging by the price, which I overheard in their conversation, they could afford such a purchase before, but they preferred to live at my expense, planning to get my house after my death. The day of their departure was sunny and warm. The movers were bringing out boxes and furniture, loading them into a large van. Langston led the way, occasionally casting irritated glances in my direction. Beatrice kept to herself, as if hesitant to approach me to say goodbye. When everything was loaded, Langston got into his car without saying goodbye. Beatrice came up to me, holding a small box. "I wanted to give you this," she said, holding out the box. "These are pictures of Mom that I found in my things. I think you should have them." I accepted the box, feeling a sudden excitement. "Thank you." "Dad," Beatrice looked into my eyes, "I know you've changed your will." "What do you think about it?" I asked. "It's your right," she answered simply. "And I guess I deserve it for what I've done, but I want you to know that I never wanted your money or your house. I'm just confused. I let Langston influence my decisions. It's my fault, and I don't hold him responsible. But I hope that one day you can forgive me." "Time will tell, Beatrice," I said. "We both have a lot to think about." She nodded, then suddenly hugged me quickly, awkwardly, as if she were a child. Then she pulled away and walked to the car, where Langston was waiting. I stood on the porch, watching their car disappear around the corner. A strange feeling of devastation and release at the same time filled me. I had won the battle for my home, for my dignity, but the price had been high, perhaps a permanent break with my only daughter. That evening, Walter came by with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. "Thought you might need some company," he said. "And a good drink." I smiled, pointing to a nearby chair. "You're right on time, friend." We sat in silence, sipping whiskey and watching the sun slowly sink below the horizon. The house behind me was mine again, with all its stories, memories, ghosts of the past. I didn't know what the future would bring, but in that moment I felt a strange peace. I had protected what I loved, what I had spent a lifetime building. I had preserved my dignity, and that, in the end, was what mattered most.